So thanks very much for your kind introduction. It's my great honor to be today to talk about learning analytics, and it's great to address this nice and big audience. And I'm also particularly pleased that learning analytics is coming more into different parts of the world, especially in Asia. And the growing trend of learning analytics and the use of data is quite important. I'm very glad that this kind of capacity development is happening as well in this part of the world. So what I'm going to talk about today is about learning analytics, which is an emerging field. And I'm not quite sure how many of you are so familiar with the field of learning analytics, so I'm going to initially give a bit of an introduction into what we mean by learning analytics and provide a bit of a kind of direction as well with respect to potential for the development of learning analytics, but with a specific focus on the Global South. And especially when I was invited to give this talk, I was asked to pay attention to what are those particular differences that had to be accounted for when we are talking about learning analytics in the Global South. But talking about learning analytics or talking anything related to technology in education is really difficult without accounting for the existing context. And basically looking into that context, what are those primary priorities or the vision that is necessary to be accounted for in the Global South? One of them is pretty much creating equal opportunities for all. And on the other hand, we are seeing not only in the Global South, but even in the Global North as well, that this divide between the poor and the rich is basically becoming bigger and bigger. So the question becomes how we can increase the accessibility of learning to everybody lifelong if we don't have even enough to support the existing ones. And then the current basically moment as well is requiring that we are basically seeing lots of discussion in terms of where the existing education is heading. What is gonna education look like? For example, there is a vision called Stanford 2020, which basically indicates that there will not be regular degree programs with the end-to-end relationship between universities, but rather students and instructors will develop this kind of, and universities, the relationship which will be lifelong. So the question becomes then how that is reflected on the quality of the types of skills that we are helping our learners to develop. And many of us are trying to develop different approaches which are more related to something like active learning that are promoting different types of advanced so-called 21st century skills. At the same time, we are trying to most efficiently use some of our internal resources in terms of planning, etc., but at the same time also increase the level of graduation of some of the students, which is a particular problem specific for many open universities. Myself being involved with Athabasca University in Canada for several years, quite appreciate the problem of student retention. But at the same time also what we want to show in terms of how universities are performing for the betterment of the overall society and economy. So to address many of these issues, many people turn to technology. And technology is seen quite frequently as a rescue. But then when we see technology in that particular case, we also are creating yet another degree of distance between students, their instructors, and their universities. And that process basically feedback loops, even although this is a pretty big crowd today, I can still get a sense of what's happening in this room. Although probably the first few rows are getting most of my attention. In the back, I really hardly see the faces of people. But instructors can see at least when they are having this face-to-face contact, what are the basically individuals that are trying to know, and perhaps they are just polite, but at least they are trying to pretend to listen. In many other cases, when we are having a distance, that is not happening, and especially when that distance is being increased with the number of students, we actually hardly can provide individual feedback. And that basically feedback is becoming even harder when we basically account for the fact that there's over 4 billion, more than 4 billion people who are not online and connected. So how do we do? What is basically the process that we want to engage? Obviously, learning analytics is not gonna change the problem of connectivity, but at least has a promise to address some of these other potential issues that are relevant. So what do we mean by learning analytics? I'm gonna start from a typical scenario that is, I think, common for many universities. And that is basically something in terms of technology that everybody is using. First one is student information systems. That's basically where we all need to keep some of our data about students' registration, students' grades, some socioeconomic and demographic variables that are collected by different types of institutions. Then the other component that many institutions are having, if not most, is some kind of learning environment. In many cases, those are different learning management systems. Moodle, for example, or Blackboard, or Desire to Learn, or even home-developed solutions. However, many instructors, and I've been also reading from the literature related to developing countries and the ways how innovation is happening, trying to basically provide more inclusive environments, that basically different types of social media is also used simply because of the increased opportunities to involve people who are coming with different types of mobile devices. So in that process, basically social media such as Twitter is commonly used not only to increase the inclusiveness, but also to help students to develop some additional types of communication skills and social networking skills that are necessary for the digital age. The other component of that process is trying to even help students to develop their information-seeking skills. Some others are trying to use blogs to help students to develop their critical thinking skills and become reflective practitioners. In many other cases, we are trying to use different types of multimedia or even trying to encourage peer development and peer collaboration. But one critical thing is, no matter what we do with all these sorts of technologies, is we are leaving a digital footprint. And that digital footprint has been always left since we had the web and the internet technologies. Initially, these digital footprints were primarily used by software engineers who were developing some of these technologies just to make sure whether these technologies worked. But over time, we realized that these also footprints can be used as something which is commonly referred to as trace or log data that can be then analyzed with different mechanisms that are coming from machine learning, statistics, or data mining. And then once we have some of these analysis, we can then make interpretations by building on the existing knowledge that we have from research and practice in education, then to provide feedback to both students and instructors. And that feedback is also coming, again, built on the principles that are coming from the learning sciences, research, educational psychology, but also principles of information visualization and human-computer interaction. So as you can see, learning analytics is something which we like to call a bricolage field which basically borrows techniques, methods, theories, and approaches from many different areas so that we can basically reduce these distances that were artificially created by technology. So what are the examples of the use of learning analytics? There are many of them. One of the best known examples of the use of analytics in education is coming from Purdue University in the US. At Purdue University, they have a problem also with student retention in one of their engineering programs. In that particular engineering program, they basically wanted to identify students of failing a course early enough so that they can potentially have early warning alerts for both students and instructors so that certain interventions can be made. They use the same configuration as I just explained. So they had their student information system, plus they also had a learning management system. And what they were doing basically in that process, they were then trying to predict the risk of students failing a course. And that risk was basically assessed at 3 levels: high risk, medium risk, or no risk at all. Those 3 risks levels were basically predicted based on the analysis of the data that were coming from the student information system and the learning management system. And then machine learning was applied, not super sophisticated, something which is called logistic regression. And then these basically risk levels were eventually presented to both students and instructors as traffic lights, thus course signals. So that basically instructors would get a red light for students who were at a high risk, and also students would get basically, for example, yellow light if they were at moderate risk. What they basically found by the use of this system is they tracked a cohort of students between 2007 and 2011 that among 5,000 students, those who took at least one course with course signals, they had a retention rate which was something in the range of 15 to 25, depends on a year, higher than it was for students who took no course with course signals. So that's pretty much one critical point, that this kind of just early warning alerts created an awareness with students, and on the other hand, also triggered instructors who then initially started basically sending numerous messages trying to engage additionally these individual students, especially those who were identified at risk. Of course, learning analytics is not just really about retention and predicting students at risk. This is a basic analysis of the entire literature that is available as of early October this year, which basically is looking into all the papers published between 2011 and 2016. As you can see, learning analytics is addressing different types of topics. So from the topics, for example, assessment, how we can improve assessment, especially something which is called stealth assessment, when we are assessing students, yet that assessment is not explicit, or where we are trying to improve our MOOCs by the means of learning analytics. Some of the topics are especially relevant and basically growing. One of these topics is predictive modeling. Obviously, as Casey mentioned initially, we want to really have our glass balls and see the future and know the future, what's going to happen. And that basically prediction modeling is not only with respect to retention, but also with respect to, for example, what kind of social network position our students are going to have, or what kind of level of critical thinking our students may have by the end of the course, or in the midterm, etc. And then another critical, basically, thing that is, I think, especially important for this audience, but not only just for this audience, I think for the rest of the world, is learning analytics adoption at the systemic level. And that's basically one critical thing that while we are seeing some great examples and institutions in the West as well, like, for example, Purdue Signals, or at the University of Michigan, they have another system, E2Coach. There's really no great example to say that we have institution-wide adoption of learning analytics. Perhaps the Open University UK, and recently I learned also the Open University Catalonia in Spain, are pretty much those universities that are kind of at the forefront of the adoption of learning analytics and the level of sophistication. So the question then becomes, to what extent learning analytics can promote equity, quality, and efficiency in the Global South? And if so, to what extent? But at the same time, what are those danger issues? And the other critical thing, which probably is a question that many may have, especially institutional leaders, and those that are responsible in implementational analytics, is what are those next steps? How to move forward in that process? So in terms of directions and in the steps that are necessary to be taken, I've basically been using this model for some time, and I model basically adopted from the field of business analytics. Not that I was initially keen at all on business analytics. As a dedicated academic, when somebody told me that we need to adopt something from business analytics, you say, well, not really. Whatever works in business doesn't really respect many of the values that we may have. However, and this is a story I said many times, is I had my kind of a small revelation or epiphany, if you wish, when I was at a panel in Australia, in Melbourne, a couple of years ago, and there was a person from Deloitte, who is one of the big consultancy organizations. And we were talking about the use of analytics in education, and he said basically, if you want to do analytics, you have to start from what we know in research, practice, and theory of a particular field before you can actually do anything with respect to analytics as well. And I said, hold on, that's exactly the position that I am also maintaining with respect to the use of learning analytics, that we need to start from what we know about learning and teaching before we engage into the use of analytics as well in higher education in particular. So that model basically is designed in such a way to has three components. These three components are very simple to explain, and they are designed in such a way when different types of learning analytics individuals can engage with institutional leaders and also other representatives of different types of universities, they can actually explain what are those key issues to be tackled. So the first one of them is data. Everybody will tell we have lots of data, but how do we get many of data? And what are the creative ways to make use of data? I mean, one of the critical things is really to be creative in that process. One of the things that is commonly, I've been told, used in different countries in the Global South is basically trying to leverage different types of social media. So that basically the process of harvesting then social media data is something that is happening and that can be done fairly easy. There are already even technologies, like for example in this project that we are working on in Australia, in which we are looking into the analytics that is going beyond the LMS, where we can basically collect data that is happening on different types of social media, whether we are talking about Twitter, different types of blogs, or Facebook, that it basically can be collected. But there are also ways that now these data are coming from these different types of social media can provide also something which is very useful. And when we are talking about, for example, efficiency with respect to the use, well, we can then basically, with some of these social media data, predict the extent to which our students are going to be successful in some of our courses, whether we are talking about course completion or even we are talking about the final grade students may have. So we did a study in 2015 in which we looked basically at the use of different types of social media, and then we basically analyzed both text, all these discussions that are happening between students, as well as the networks, social networks that are happening between students. And basically we are able to see that we can explain a considerable proportion of students' grades in such networks. So from the perspective of quality as well, even in 2005, when I first started to do learning analytics at the time, I didn't call it like that. I didn't know even how to call that. Anyways, we eventually ended up calling it loco analytics, which basically in Spanish loco means madness or craziness. And because basically in a way many people would say about learning as well to apply to that extent. We were then looking at the extent to which students' discourse, online discussions, for example, students may have in different types of social media can be useful way to mitigate the shortcomings that we are seeing with different instruments that are commonly used for students' evaluation of teaching. And basically what is happening in many institutions is that we have end-of-course surveys where when everything is done, everything is finished. But we really don't know what's happening inside of our courses as the courses are progressing. What we basically identified by basically working with many different types of instructors was that feedback obtained by the analysis of the online discussions was the most appreciated by instructors in terms of their potential improvement of the courses and even improvement of their teaching strategies. And so based on the discourse, we can identify the sentiments that are happening, but to the extent to which our students are, for example, satisfied or not satisfied, but also we can see what are those emerging topics and themes. And Bottom did also some of the work, who is here, and yesterday had a tutorial on learning analytics with respect to the analysis of different types of social media and the types of topics that are emerging from social media. So that basically can tell us an important thing, how our institutions can become more responsive to the needs of our students, understand basically the pulse of our students as certain things are happening. Of course, that's one thing, and we can basically have all these issues with respect to data. However, we also have to have inside of our institutions support of IT. One story that I commonly say is when I was still in Canada, I was working with one Canadian university, and basically in that institution, their vice president, academic, basically wanted to stimulate innovation, education and innovation. And they basically offer different types of grants for faculty that they can use to innovate with respect to certain technologies. Basically, we were involved in one of these grants. We developed this beautiful learning analytics technology, and then we wanted to implement it. But then it boiled down to the process of implementation, then we wanted to basically use our institutional management system. At that point, we had to deal with the IT unit, and IT unit said no, because that's against our policy. And so you can see that one part of the university may have one perspective, one strategy, and different types of policies, and the other part of the university may have a completely different types of policy. So it took us about 6 months of negotiation to eventually pull that process through all the hoops and get all the relevant stakeholders on the same page. The other critical thing is that in many cases we are potentially developing different types of apps, different types of technology can probably be used in different types of offline models. I think that's really important in terms of limited connectivity. So the question becomes the extent to which we can collect data offline and then synchronize these data when students get online at any point in time, and have students opportunities to increase different types of equitable positions for different individuals, is how we can even some of that offline data be collected and imported. And I think that's a really kind of an important challenge that has to be tackled if we want to increase the inclusiveness in terms of the feedback support and other support that can be provided to students, especially in the Global South. Well, what is really a critical thing, in my opinion, is in this process is relevant to basically encourage collaboration within institutions so that we can develop different types of technologies that can be open source and used across many different institutions. In the Global South, we have lots of success stories, at least to a certain extent, to which I know, although of course they are quite often also associated with different types of risks and constraints as well, is that we can all use and leverage different types of open educational resources. To the similar extent, also different types of open source technologies. In 2011, the Society for Learning Analytics Research published a white paper on open learning analytics. In the meantime, we basically collaborated with our friends from Apereo Foundation, which is an open source foundation supporting Sakai, which is one of the learning management systems, but they are also responsible for many other open source technologies that are not necessarily related just to Sakai. They are developing this learning analytics initiative, which is exactly open source technology that has also benefit of increased collaboration and participation of different types of institutions that can share the expertise and also different types of tooling so that you don't necessarily have to depend on the use of the different types of vendors that are providing quite often proprietary solutions and different types of black boxes in terms of predictive algorithms that don't really mean much, or they are not necessarily fully equitable or clear with respect to the benefits that can be offered to each and every learner. But then there's another component of this model. And this component of the model is related to something which is indeed called modeling. So whenever we have some of these data, we want to analyze these data and eventually the final result of that is something which is commonly called like predictive model which is basically becoming our glass bowl, the model that tells us everything. But many institutions and even in the business sector, organizations think that just basically crunching data without having a clear question why we are doing this in the first place is leading to many negative experiences. This is a very common scenario that is experienced by many. We'll basically outsource some of that to the external consultant to basically crunch our data. They'll return to us with lots of answers, yet we are not sure which questions they answered. So do we really want our institutions to be unclear what questions? So the clear first step for every institution is to have a very clearly articulated question. I already gave this example of Purdue University. In their case, there was retention. In many other cases, like for example, University of Edinburgh doesn't have a problem of student retention, but we have problem, for example, of students' feedback. Quality and perception of feedback, how we can address some of these questions and how analytics can be helpful in that process. One key thing which goes along all these three dimensions that I'm talking about today, quality, efficiency, and equity, is really one size fits all doesn't work in learning analytics. That's a really key point. Every institution is different. Every institution operates in a different political context. Every institution serves the different cultural needs of different students. Every institution has different unique learners, and every learner is different. So therefore, one size fits all really goes across the board. In terms of, for example, quality, if you want to understand what are those factors that are predicting the best the quality of, for example, some of the learning experiences and the extent to which we can identify success factors, then we can't really just wash away the instructional conditions in which certain courses happen. We ran a study in Australia with about 5,000 students. Courses were basically offered in the blended learning model, and we basically had higher enrollment courses, some cases over 1,000 students. When we combined all these courses and created one predictive model, we identified some of these predictors which were, quite honestly, useless. Like, for example, number of logins. Number of logins tells you something, but really can't tell you much about the improvement of learning and teaching. But why? Because these predictive models, if you ignore instructional factors, eventually end up telling you something which is the least common denominator across different courses or contexts. However, when we build these models specific for individual courses, that's where you are getting actually deep insight. And then you are actually realizing that in some courses, nothing was explained by some of these predictive models. And then when we talked to the instructors, they told us, Sure, because nothing was happening in the LMS. Everything was happening in social media. So we need to basically account for that context if we want to have the quality of our education supported with some of the analytics. The other critical thing is that in terms of efficiency, everybody loves to say, well, why don't we develop our beautiful predictive models by ignoring our institutional context? We can't. We have to account the complexity of our institutional context. We need to account what are those existing investments, what are those funding models, what are those motivations that institutions have, and also what is the strategy of a particular institution. So there was really one fairly interesting attempt, which was called Open Academic Analytics Initiative, where they basically wanted to develop a predictive model in one institution and then reuse that predictive model in other institutions in terms of basically student retention. I can probably say comfortably the initiative failed miserably. Why? Because they basically trained the model in one of the liberal arts US colleges, which basically is serving highly rich population of students with specific types of needs, and then they wanted to apply this model in different types of community colleges that were serving not really that rich kids at all. And they were serving completely different types of also instructional models. Therefore, these types of models cannot be reused. And I think we are getting into the era that even learning analytics service providers are realizing that, and they are quite clear in terms of the provisioning of such models. Therefore, if you are going to design and use learning analytics, especially with respect to the efficiency, you need to really account for the institutional conditions. Otherwise, don't even try to attempt, because you are probably going to waste a lot of time. In terms of equity, we talk quite frequently about beautiful predictors that learning analytics can tell us. However, the reality is, and a colleague of mine from the University of Technology in Eindhoven in the Netherlands ran a study basically by trying to see the extent to which, for example, some of these sensitive predictors, for example, gender, or socioeconomic status, or, for example, race, can make a difference in terms of identification of certain issues. So, for example, if we are talking about information technologies or computer science, we can frequently find that, for example, gender is a great predictor, meaning that basically there's about 15 to 20% of women, unfortunately, in different types of computer science programs. However, what is really a danger thing is if you are automatically making decisions based on these predictive models. Because if you start making them, what you are going to do is you are going to promote that bias even additionally. That means in 5 years' time down the road, you are going to have fewer women. So learning analytics is great to help you detect some of these inequity issues, but then you have to work with analytics in terms of different types of programs that are informed with such analytics so that you can then improve the pressing issues and promote certain types of activities that are of the priority for your particular institution. Otherwise, analytics can become a really big danger for you in terms of equity. There's another critical thing is many institutions are engaging with different types of service providers, and they give you different types of algorithms. We know, for example, that algorithms are not really easy to explain to non-experts, but at the same time, we are entering into the era where we are using data intensively, and algorithms are going to make or help us inform many decisions. Thus, we have to have algorithms that are accountable. We have to also have algorithms that are transparent, that we know why they suggested certain particular issues, and the extent to which they were built and they are accurate, and the extent about potential negative consequences. Colleague Simon Buckingham from the University of Technology, Sydney is basically advocating algorithmic accountability in learning analytics. And I would definitely suggest exploring some of that work, especially in the light of trying to avoid different types of inequity issues that analytics can unintentionally promote. Transformation. The final component of this model is most of the initiatives that we are currently seeing with respect to analytics are being adopted top-down, meaning that very few examples of the existing learning analytics technologies have been developed by the involvement of different stakeholders. And in this particular case, I mean our primary stakeholder, our students. Hardly anybody does that. And we are making a promise that we are going to improve the feedback for our learners. So that's really one critical thing. So we need to have that participatory design of the tools that are needed for our learners, not that we see from the top what is necessary for learners. Then the second group of basically stakeholders that is also fairly frequently ignored is the instructors and teaching staff. They also have to be involved in that process. We cannot have these decisions with respect to analytics just being made by chief information officers and the university leadership or the individuals who are responsible for learning analytics implementation. We have to understand why we are trying to and what we are trying to do with this. In another case, we are also seeing lots of analytics which is designed just for statistic experts. And reality is that in such cases, we are creating beautifully looking charts that are harmful. Even for top students, even in the top universities in the world. Like, for example, a study at the University of Melbourne. They basically asked top performing students with top high goals in courses to interpret some of these dashboards. And these dashboards are commonly implemented in such a way that an individual is compared to the class average. And the top students basically thought that they were doing well, although they were underperforming just because the chart showed that they were slightly above the average. But being slightly above the average doesn't mean that you are satisfied in meeting your own goals. So we really don't even communicate that message clearly to the students, and our students in many cases don't have clear understanding of some of these analytics, what are necessary in the process. Therefore, we need to avoid some of these biases. In terms of the quality, well, one of the key points of the quality education is really feedback. In many cases, students don't perceive dashboards as feedback. We ran another study with a course at the University of Sydney, and the course did really well. It was a flipped classroom course with about 450 students. The overall course evaluation was over 4 on a 5-point scale. However, the feedback evaluation was only 3.2. And then we explore externally, well, almost every other course even had lower perception of feedback. So 1 year we introduced a dashboard, nothing changed. Students don't perceive some of these dashboards as feedback. Why? Well, because we haven't looked into the feedback literature, right? And the literature on educational feedback is quite rich. And some of that literature basically tells us that feedback needs to speak task-specific language. The other thing is feedback needs to provide instruction to students what to do next when they are stuck. Dashboards provide nothing of that. They are usually just even accelerating or amplifying, in many cases, cognitive load that students are dealing. However, the good news is that there are analytics approaches that can be used that are not dashboards, that are actually automated emails generated to students that are offering such opportunities, that are basically allowing instructors to, for the amount of work necessary to support 4 students, they can address hundreds of students. And that's really something that can be done, so that basically you are identifying particular tasks that your students are working on, and then you identify the level of engagement of relevance for those particular tasks, and then students are basically being fed with the messages of relevance for tasks, with the instruction what to do, and by recognition of their previous work. One last point with respect to the directions, and that's development of capabilities to exploit big data. In many cases, institutions don't have enough opportunities. We really don't want anywhere that we are developing data scientists. Not everybody should become a data scientist. But data savvy, I think they should. Even if we are talking about students, regardless of the part of the world, data savviness is necessary. Let's say students need to eventually be in the real world and borrow some money from different banks. Reality is we all borrow money from different banks. And in that particular case, they are going to flip different types of charts. So you need to understand what some of these charts means. And that's the kind of literacy that it has a very practical value for everybody. But I think one of the critical things is that we really need to develop this data savviness that is necessary. So In terms of equity and how we want to transform our institutions, very few institutions have clear policies. With respect to, for example, what does it mean student privacy? What does it mean informed consent? I'm hearing that there are in different parts of the world, although they are not commonly basically on the radar on the common development of learning analytics, some really excellent work done. But in terms of privacy, there are some quite concerning news as well. Therefore, basically, the privacy is something very relevant, but privacy cannot come from a single source or a particular country. Everybody has to define the notion of privacy for their own basically specific culture or their particular context. Also with respect to the ethics, what is ethical? For example, let me just give you an example at the University of Edinburgh. Our basically current data privacy policy of the university says that we can use analytics but just on anonymized data. Fair enough. Students protected. We identified some students at risk. Then we don't know who those students are because their names are anonymized. And we are stuck. So the question is that ethical? And basically the tension between ethics and privacy, and there are plenty other types of tensions that are available in terms of personalization, equity issues, etc. So at the moment we are developing a learning analytics policy development framework, which should serve higher education institutions as a kind of a checklist and also a process how they can develop their own institutional policies, starting basically from the scan of their political context to the point of identifying key stakeholders and their involvement, to the point of identification, what are those priorities for learning analytics that has to serve for a particular institution, to the point basically of the design different types of engagement strategies. And then one of the key points is as well monitoring and the learning from the existing use of learning analytics. Very few institutions are doing basically evaluating the extent to which analytics is being effective and how that learning analytics is also being improved. Anyways, this is something that is an opportunity, I think, for many to collaborate, and also would welcome as well collaboration in this process with this audience. So, few final remarks before I wrap up. Key point, leadership is something which is crucial. What we are observing when we are talking with different learning analytics observers is that many institutions approach them, yet they don't have clear leadership designed with respect to learning analytics. We need to create that leadership that is creative in terms of how analytics can be beneficial for their institutions and also that is recognized in institutional context. In many cases, we are ending up with institutions that are on the levels of sophistications 1 and 2, according to the SOLAR model that was developed in 2014. And it basically means we are just doing some like basic reports, or we are doing some early experimentation. And then we interviewed some leaders in different institutions in Australia and now in Europe, and they tell us, oh yeah, we are doing now just some experimentation and then personalized learning. As if personalized learning will come as a magic and little else will bring it overnight without really clear vision how to engage to that extent. Another critical thing is equal engagement necessary with stakeholders. I already elaborated on this point several times. But one critical thing many institutions don't realize is when you are using analytics, business as usual doesn't work anymore. You identify that certain processes don't work. You need to fix those processes. You need to address, you need to have interventions that are doing something. So if you are going to use analytics as another node, but you are not having any mechanisms that you are going to act upon that analytics, then analytics is useless in particular context. Another critical thing, training. Training opportunities for instructors, how to use effectively learning analytics. If that training doesn't exist, just because analytics as an opportunity exists, doesn't mean that instructors and students or everybody in the institution will use it that effectively. Another critical thing I already mentioned is the measurement. Especially in these particular contexts, I think different types of design-based approaches would be quite effective. I don't think randomized controlled trials are necessarily a good approach to measure some of these things. But also different types of measurements and instruments are necessary in terms of the perceived quality that students are seeing from the analytics that is coming, and also discrepancy between the expectations students may have and the services that are perceived at the moment are quite critical. Already mentioned the learning analytics policy and strategy as a critical thing, but I also even emphasize cross-institutional collaboration. I think that's the role where I'm seeing opportunities that the Asian Association of Open Universities can play a big task in the process. Obviously, with the collaboration with the International Council for Distance Education, next month there will be a President's Summit. They also asked us to write a commission paper on learning analytics. So there's clearly good potential there. Society for Learning Analytics can help there, but there are many other organizations that can facilitate that process. I already mentioned Aperio Foundation, and there are many other organizations that can play in that process who are committed to openness in this whole process and different types of values that are common across the board. And the final point, and I'm going to stop after this point, is the development of analytics culture. In many cases, what we are seeing with respect to analytics is that we have a rhetoric of simplistic technological fixes. Let's buy this beautiful product, it'll solve all our problems. Be realistic. No technology in the last 120 years, since we are basically looking into more kind of digital or electronic technologies, solve all our problems. In many cases, even created many new problems. So we need to basically move away from this kind of beautiful picture that many are trying to paint in terms of Moneyball, that is telling us the movie, what we can do to improve, for example, in that particular case, the performance of a team with the use of advanced analytics, and also think in terms of that analytics is imperfect. Analytics can inform many things, but it can't replace our decision making. Analytics cannot replace the tacit knowledge that is available inside of many practitioners. And we need to basically respect, for example, like this particular movie, which is on the other hand showed as Trouble with the Curve, where the kid who was predicted by all the algorithms to be a perfect baseball player eventually turns out not to be. And the algorithm was never 100% precise. So bear that in mind where you are adopting your learning analytics. And on that note, I'm going to thank very much for your attention.